Welcome to Bella&Goch. Today we are exploring Anvil Aerospace, the Terra-based manufacturer that has defined military spacecraft design for nearly 2 centuries. Founded in 2772 by the eccentric J. Harris Arnold in Nova Kiev, Terra, this company emerged from an era when spacecraft engineering was still a craft practiced by obsessive hands-on designers rather than corporate committees. Arnold personally led every design project for the first 70 years, signing off on individual subsystems with a precision that would seem antiquated today. But how did a single Terran startup become the backbone of UEE Navy carrier wings? To understand why every capital ship in United Empire of Earth space carries at least one Anvil squadron today, and why their fighters have destroyed more enemy hardware measured in star credits than all other current Navy designs combined, we need to examine the philosophy that turned military contracts into an art form starting in that original Nova Kiev skunkworks facility. To understand Anvil's distinctive visual language, we must look back at J. Harris Arnold's school days, when he became obsessed with the largely forgotten engineer Leonard Casse. Arnold saw in Casse's work everything he loved about spacecraft design, adopting signature elements like curved wings and the open circle signet that still marks Anvil ships today. The similarities were so striking that a holding firm owning Casse's rights actually sued Arnold's startup, threatening to crush the young company before it could secure its first military contract. Rather than fight a prolonged legal battle, Arnold made a bold move in the early 2780s. He purchased the entire Casse Aerospace portfolio outright, settling the dispute by absorbing his idol's legacy into Anvil's DNA. This acquisition didn't just resolve litigation, it established a design philosophy that would eventually produce the Hurricane and Gladiator lines. The company's very name comes from Robert Calvin's famous justification for UEE expansion, where he wrote that military spending fuels the furnaces of expansion and strikes the anvils of innovation. For 2 centuries, Anvil has embodied this principle, delivering the Hornet, Osprey, Devastator, Hurricane, and Gladiator to Navy carriers across human space. Here's the statistic that matters. Hornet fighters alone have destroyed more enemy hardware, measured in star credits, than all other current Navy space fighter designs combined. Every military campaign launched in the last 200 years has featured Anvil spacecraft at the forefront, and no carrier operates today without at least one Anvil squadron. Even as their civilian division opened in Sherman, Castra system to serve private enterprise, the company never forgot that their reputation was forged in the furnace of combat, not the comfort of commercial trade. Since adopting that martial philosophy in 2772, Anvil Aerospace has systematically forged the backbone of UEE naval aviation across 2 centuries of continuous conflict. The manufacturer's production lines have delivered 5 legendary combat platforms that define military space superiority: the Hurricane Heavy Fighter, the versatile Gladiator bomber, the Osprey support craft, the devastating Devastator, and most significantly, the F-7 Hornet series. Naval historians track engagement metrics obsessively, and the numbers reveal Anvil's absolute dominance in ship-to-ship combat. Hornet variants alone have eliminated enemy assets valued at higher star credit totals than every other active Navy fighter design combined, a statistic that underscores why every capital ship in UEE service maintains at least one squadron of Anvil-designed interceptors. From the First Terran War to current Vandal incursions along the frontier, no military operation launches without these Terra-built spacecraft leading the vanguard into hostile territory. But beneath these kill counts and carrier deployments lies the architectural DNA of a single eccentric visionary who absolutely refused to delegate authority. J. Harris Arnold personally oversaw every design project during Anvil's first 70 years of existence, operating from the original skunkworks facility located in Nova Kiev, Terra, where he insisted on reviewing and signing off on every subsystem schematic himself. This obsessive hands-on approach stemmed directly from his academic fascination with Leonard Casse, the mostly forgotten engineer whose curved wings and circular signets Arnold so admired that Anvil's early production blueprints actually triggered a major lawsuit from Casse Aerospace's corporate holding firm. Rather than engage in prolonged litigation, Arnold simply purchased the entire portfolio outright in 2781, absorbing Casse's intellectual property and permanently legalizing the aesthetic heritage that still defines Anvil's recognizable circular machine gun mounts and distinctive green HUD interfaces across both civilian and military product lines. Yet Anvil's board recognized that frontier survival increasingly required arming private operators, not just official naval squadrons. In 2943, the corporation formally established its Civilian Development Division, specifically to translate military-grade deterrence into accessible personal defense platforms for everyday citizens facing escalating vandal raids and relentless nine-tails piracy across the outer systems. This strategic commercial pivot now operates from a dedicated production facility located in Sherman, Castra system, where modified assembly lines produce civilian legal variants of previously classified hardware under export license. The division's mandate reflects cold economic reality, with UEE advocacy forces demonstrably stretched thin across lawless regions like Pyro and the corporate expanse of Stanton. Anvil profits enormously by selling Hornet exports and Hurricane variants directly to Bounty Hunters Guild members and independent operators who demand the same green-tinted targeting displays and circular ballistic mounts that elite naval aces have relied upon for centuries. The furnaces of expansion never stop burning, but now they strike blades for anyone carrying sufficient credits. With the formal establishment of its Civilian Development Division, finalized in 2943, Anvil Aerospace positioned a dedicated production complex in Sherman, Castra system, specifically to bridge the gap between naval exclusivity and private sector necessity. This facility wasn't merely a concession to commercial markets. It represented a calculated response to escalating vandal incursions and the rampant pirate raids devastating frontier settlements across Pyro and Stanton's outer reaches. By transferring military-grade specifications directly into civilian hands, the Terra-based manufacturer sought to transform independent pilots into viable defensive assets capable of protecting corporate convoys and remote outposts without direct UEE Navy intervention. The division's mandate explicitly focused on adapting proven naval architectures, originally forged for UEE carrier squadrons and heavy destroyer battle groups, into accessible deterrence for everyday operators navigating increasingly volatile space lanes where advocacy patrols remain virtually non-existent. Sherman's assembly lines began rolling out civilian-adapted variants of Anvil's most trusted combat platforms, translating 2 centuries of naval warfare data into cockpits accessible to independent merchants and bounty hunters guild contractors. The F-7C Hornet Mk Roman II emerged as the division's flagship offering, stripping out classified UEE encryption modules while retaining the distinctive circular ball turret mount and the lethal energy management systems that had made its military predecessor the Navy's highest-scoring fighter in terms of destroyed enemy hardware. Similarly, the Gladiator bomber configuration found new life protecting corporate mining expeditions in the unregulated sectors of the Stanton system, offering heavy torpedo capabilities previously reserved for capital ship engagements. This transfer of battle-proven technology represented an unprecedented democratization of firepower, effectively placing the same tools that had secured UEE expansion into the hands of private operators facing nine-tails ambushes along the Pyro shipping lanes. Today, Anvil's dual market dominance stands as a testament to J. Harris Arnold's original vision, bridging the militarized heritage of Nova Kiev with Sherman's commercial pragmatism in the year 2954. While the Castra facility continues arming frontier pilots against Vandal clan ships and Xenothreat insurgents, every civilian vessel still carries the DNA of Arnold's obsessive design philosophy, complete with circular signet mounts and signature green HUD interfaces derived from Casse Aerospace patterns. The corporation has effectively blurred the line between naval auxiliary and private militia, ensuring that no carrier group deploys without Anvil squadrons, while simultaneously guaranteeing that independent captains piloting Carrack explorers or civilian F-7C fighters can deploy defensive capabilities capable of repelling Nine Tails ambushes along the Stanton Pyro corridor. This strategic equilibrium, forged in the fires of 2 centuries of continuous warfare, now defines humanity's distributed defense posture across both the ordered systems of Terra and the lawless void of Pyro. Robert Calvin's expansionist maxim about striking the anvils of innovation wasn't merely poetic rhetoric for the UEE Navy. It became the operational reality that Anvil Aerospace inscribed into every hull code stamped at their Nova Kiev facility. Consider the raw data from 2 centuries of warfare. Every single capital carrier deployed in UEE space currently maintains at least 1 full squadron of Anvil-designed fighters, with many commanding officers refusing to sortie without Hurricane interceptors or Gladiator bombers complementing their flight wings. The Hornet series alone presents a staggering metric of lethality, having annihilated more enemy assets measured in star credits than the combined output of all other active Navy fighter designs put together. This dominance stems from a catalog that includes the Devastator heavy fighter and the Osprey tactical platform, each forged under Arnold's obsessive oversight, where every subsystem bore his personal signature. No military campaign launched since 2772 has commenced without Anvil spacecraft leading the vanguard, a streak of battlefield dependency that explains why Terra's military-industrial complex treats Nova Kiev as sacred ground. Before the military contracts cemented Anvil's reputation, J. Harris Arnold faced a legal battle that nearly scuttled his entire enterprise during the company's first decade. As a student, Arnold had fixated on the forgotten engineering genius Leonard Casse, whose curved wing designs and distinctive open circle signets shaped his own aesthetic sensibilities so heavily that Anvil's early prototypes drew immediate litigation from the holding firm that owned Casse Aerospace's dormant intellectual property. Rather than litigate the similarities in Terra's courts, Arnold chose an audacious solution in 2784. He purchased the entire Casse portfolio outright, absorbing the very company whose ghost had haunted his drawing boards. This acquisition wasn't merely defensive legal maneuvering. It legitimized the circular gun mounts and arcing hull lines that would become Anvil's visual trademark across the Hurricane and Hornet series. By settling the suit through acquisition, Arnold secured not just legal clarity but a philosophical lineage, binding his militarized future to Casse's forgotten past with a transaction that redefined Terran corporate consolidation. Castra Systems' Sherman facility represents the physical manifestation of Anvil's reluctant but necessary evolution toward private sector survival. Established specifically to transfer military-grade specifications into commercially viable platforms, this production hub began rolling out the F-7C Hornet Mk Roman II and civilian-configured Gladiator bombers to counter the Vandal swarm raids devastating frontier systems like Pyro. The transition wasn't without internal resistance. Nova Kiev's purists argued that diluting naval-grade hardware for merchant pilots compromised the company's martial integrity. Yet the statistics from 2954 validate the decision. Advocacy reports indicate that civilian Anvil operators have destroyed over 40% of documented pirate vessels encountered in Stanton's shipping lanes. Sherman now operates as the primary pipeline converting classified naval avionics into accessible deterrence, ensuring that independent pilots flying Crusader Industries platforms or hauling cargo through Pyro possess the same targeting systems trusted by Admiralty squadrons. This bifurcated production model, Terra's military precision fused with Castra's commercial pragmatism, has ultimately armed both the UEE's formal campaigns and the frontier's informal wars. Specifications into hands of ordinary citizens, Sherman's engineers faced a frontier increasingly volatile from Vandal incursions and Nine Tails raids. The F-7C Hornet Mk Roman II became their first major civilian adaptation, stripping classified targeting systems while retaining the airframe's devastating agility. Alongside it, the Gladiator bomber configuration offered private militias the same torpedo capabilities that once shattered Tevran shield generators during the Second War. Both designs rolled out of Castra's assembly lines in 2943, marketed not as luxury items, but as survival tools for systems beyond advocacy reach. Anvil's Terra-based executives initially balked at arming untrained civilians with military-grade hardware, yet the profit margins and political necessity proved irresistible. By 2945, these civilian models generated revenue streams rivaling the UEE Navy's bulk orders, fundamentally altering the company's fiscal DNA while keeping the assembly lines humming for future conflicts. Robert Calvin's expansionist maxim regarding furnaces and anvils wasn't merely poetic justification for UEE military spending. It became Anvil's literal business strategy throughout 2 centuries of continuous production. The company's portfolio reads like a roster of every major conflict since 2772. The Hurricane heavy fighter dominating squadron actions during the Messer era, the Devastator and Osprey platforms providing critical air support in countless system defense actions. Yet no statistic captures Anvil's lethality quite like the Hornet's combat record. Specifically, that single airframe has destroyed more enemy hardware, measured in star credits, than all other current Navy fighter designs combined. This data point, verified by UEE Naval Intelligence Archives, reflects not merely quantity, but a design philosophy prioritizing pilot survivability and firepower density. When the Vandal clans breach defensive lines or pirate fleets mass near Pyro, Admiralty Dispatch orders invariably list Anvil squadrons first, trusting that the Terra-based manufacturer's reputation translates directly into tactical advantage on the battlefield. Long before the UEE Navy placed its first bulk order, J. Harris Arnold established his skunkworks in Nova Kiev during 2772, personally scrutinizing every subsystem signature in an era when spacecraft design still bore the fingerprints of individual craftsmen rather than corporate automation. Arnold's obsession with Leonard Casse, the mostly forgotten engineer whose curved wings and circular signets defined early Terran aesthetics, nearly bankrupted the startup before it sold a single hull. When Anvil's debut models appeared, the holding firm controlling Casse's dormant portfolio sued for design theft, citing identical wing geometries and the distinctive open circle machine gun mounts that remain iconic today. Rather than engage in protracted litigation, Arnold settled by purchasing Casse Aerospace outright, acquiring not just legal protection, but a philosophical legacy that prioritized visual form married to lethal function. This eccentric founder's insistence on micromanaging each blueprint created Anvil's DNA. Spacecraft built for maximum pilot visibility, devastating forward firepower, and the institutional memory that would eventually allow Sherman's engineers to adapt military gladiators for civilian frontier defense nearly 2 centuries later. Design was dominated by rigid corporate committees. Arnold's insistence on reviewing every bolt and circuit breaker himself created a bottleneck that drove competitors mad, yet it forged a reputation for mechanical reliability that Terra's industrial elite couldn't ignore. But here is where the narrative takes an unexpected turn. Young Arnold's fixation with Leonard Casse, the largely obscure engineer whose curved wing geometries and circular gun mounts had fallen into corporate obscurity by the 28th century. When Anvil's early prototypes appeared sporting those distinctive open circle signets and arched wing profiles, the holding firm that had purchased Casse Aerospace's dormant intellectual property filed suit immediately. Rather than engage in prolonged litigation, Arnold executed a maneuver that defined his business acumen. He acquired the entire Casse portfolio outright, settling the dispute by absorbing the very inspiration that had shaped his aesthetic vision from the beginning. By 2872, Anvil had secured its inaugural UEE Navy contract, initiating a partnership that now spans nearly 2 centuries of continuous production. The corporate moniker itself derives from Robert Calvin's infamous expansionist treatise, specifically his metaphor regarding military expenditure, fueling furnaces, while striking anvils of innovation, a phrase that resonated with Arnold's own industrial philosophy. Throughout the intervening decades, Anvil's manufacturing lines delivered the Osprey reconnaissance craft, the Hurricane heavy fighter, the Devastator bomber platform, the Gladiator torpedo carrier, and the ubiquitous F-7A Hornet space superiority fighter. Documentation from the Messer era through the current Imperators regime confirms a singular reality: no offensive deployment in UEE history has launched without Anvil craft occupying forward positions, and every operational carrier currently in service maintains at least one dedicated squadron of Anvil-designed interceptors. Combat telemetry, aggregated across 200 years, reveals Anvil airframes have recorded more confirmed space-to-space kills than any competing manufacturer, with Hornet variants alone accounting for more destroyed enemy hardware, measured in star credit valuations, than all other active Navy fighter designs combined. The Sherman production complex in Castra system now serves as the primary conduit for translating battlefield specifications into civilian market hardware. Established during the accelerated Vandal incursion period of the 2940, this facility specifically addresses the shortage of combat-capable vessels available to frontier settlements facing escalating pirate raids. Anvil's Civilian Development Division operates under a straightforward mandate: weaponized deterrence should not remain exclusive to government fleets when independent traders require identical protective capabilities. Recent production manifests indicate steady output of demilitarized Hornet variants alongside Gladiator hulls retrofitted for private salvage operations. This strategic pivot represents more than commercial expansion. It acknowledges that UEE Admiralty contracts alone cannot secure human space against dispersed threats. By placing military-grade avionics and hardened shielding into citizen hands through Sherman's assembly lines, Anvil effectively extends the Navy's deterrent presence into systems where advocacy patrols remain theoretical rather than tactical realities. Completed during the height of Vandal aggression between 2925 and 2930, the Sherman facility represented Arnold's final strategic gamble, proving that military-grade hardware could retain its lethality while meeting civilian regulatory standards. The first production line rolled out the F-7C Hornet MKI in 2931, translating carrier-grade specifications into modular configurations for private ownership. Engineers faced immediate challenges adapting the Hurricane's ball turret systems for non-military operators, yet the resulting technical manuals established industry benchmarks that competitors like Drake Interplanetary still struggle to match. Unlike Aegis Dynamics' civilian conversions that often strip essential combat systems, Anvil's approach maintained full weapons compatibility, allowing owners to legally purchase Navy standard ordnance through authorized dealers. This policy decision, ratified by the UEE Manufacturing Oversight Committee in 2934, fundamentally altered the frontier defense economy, placing Devastator-class firepower literally within reach of independent operators facing Vandal raiding parties. Harris Arnold's architectural fingerprints remain visible across every welded seam produced at the Nova Kiev headquarters, where the executive team still maintains his original drafting archives from 2772. When the holding firm controlling Leonard Casse's intellectual property threatened litigation in 2781, Arnold resolved the dispute not through prolonged judicial proceedings, but by outright acquisition of the entire Casse Aerospace portfolio, effectively swallowing his primary aesthetic influence. This corporate maneuver preserved the distinctive curved wing geometries and circular gun mount signets that define Anvil's visual language, elements originally pioneered by Casse during the First Tevarin War. Unlike modern design-by-committee approaches at competitor firms, Arnold's methodology demanded personal inspection of every subsystem schematic, a practice that slowed production timelines, but eliminated the structural failures plaguing RSIS early combat models. The settlement terms, finalized in Terra's commercial courts during 2782, effectively merged two engineering bloodlines into the singular corporate entity dominating Terra's industrial sector today. Contemporary fleet assessments reveal the quantitative impact of 2 centuries under Navy contract. Hornet variants alone account for more destroyed enemy assets, measured in star credits, than all competing fighter designs currently operational combined. This staggering metric stems from continuous deployment across every major UEE military action since the Messer era, from the Gladiator bombing runs over Garen Roman II to Hurricane escort wings screening capital ships during the 2945 Vandal incursions at Vega. Robert Calvin's early justification for imperial expansion, his quote about striking anvils of innovation, provided not merely a poetic namesake, but a philosophical framework that justified Anvil's exclusive focus on combat applications over civilian transport. While competitors diversified into luxury yachts or cargo haulers, the Terra-based manufacturer concentrated resources on perfecting the Osprey and Devastator lineages, ensuring that when frontier militias required genuine military deterrence, they inevitably orbit toward Castra Systems' Sherman yards rather than compromise with repurposed corporate shuttles. But raw statistics only tell half the story. The other half lives in corporate strategy. When Frontier Systems began reporting increased Vandal incursions and Nine Tails raids during the 2920s, Anvil's leadership recognized that military contracts alone couldn't protect scattered colonies. In 2935, the board approved the Civilian Development Division, explicitly chartered to retrofit classified military architectures for private ownership. This wasn't charity. It was market expansion, targeting independent operators who needed hurricane-grade firepower without Navy clearance. The division's first major project, retrofitting the F-7A Hornet into the commercially available F-7C variant, required stripping classified avionics while preserving the signature circular gun mount and green tactical interface that pilots had come to trust. By opening their archives to legitimate buyers, Anvil effectively militarized the merchant class, turning cargo haulers into combat-capable assets without sacrificing the visual language that Arnold codified in 2772. The physical manifestation of this dual-market philosophy sits in Sherman, a fortified industrial city within the Castra system that the Navy prioritizes for secure manufacturing. Unlike the original Nova Kiev skunkworks, where Arnold personally inspected every subsystem, Sherman operates at planetary scale, churning out Gladiator bombers and Osprey scouts alongside their civilian counterparts. Inspection of the assembly floors reveals the curved wing profiles and open circle signets that Arnold borrowed from Leonard Casse's portfolio, visual continuity across 2 centuries of production. The facility's location wasn't accidental. Castra's military governor specifically invited Anvil in 2901 to secure the supply chain against pyro-based piracy. Today, Sherman's output represents nearly 40% of all military spacecraft commissioned by the UEE Navy, a dominance that explains why every capital carrier from the Mac Arthur to the Musashi maintains dedicated Anvil squadrons. Pinpointing the Anvil design language requires examining the pilot environment interface. Expansive canopy sightlines prioritize situational awareness over armor plating, while that distinctive circular machine gun mount frames the forward viewport alongside the signature green UI glowing against vacuum blackness. These elements are not aesthetic accidents. They constitute functional inheritances from Arnold's original specifications, where the designer insisted that visibility equals survivability. Comparing these features to the cramped, sensor-restricted cockpits of a Drake Cutlass or the holographic overload typical of micro-tech explorers reveals Anvil's core philosophy. Human eyes still matter in an age of automated targeting. Pilots flying a Devastator against Vandal raiders or running cargo in a civilian Hornet above ArcCorp experience the unbroken design lineage of 2772, proving that Arnold's obsession with pilot-centric engineering outlasted every corporate trend that tried to bury it. Our signet dominating the fuselage serves as more than corporate branding. It represents a direct lineage to Leonard Casse's original engineering principles developed centuries earlier. When J. Harris Arnold founded Anvil in 2772, he drew so heavily from Casse's curved wing designs and open circle motifs that the holding firm controlling the late engineer's portfolio promptly sued for intellectual property infringement across Terra's commercial courts. Rather than engage in protracted litigation that might stall his Nova Kiev operations, Arnold purchased Casse Aerospace outright in a settlement that transferred all archived blueprints, proprietary wing configurations, and the distinctive circular machine gun mounting system to Anvil's control. This acquisition permanently embedded the circular signet and sweeping aerodynamic profiles into the company's DNA, creating visual signatures instantly recognizable across every subsequent fighter craft from the Osprey to the Gladiator. Drawing inspiration from Robert Calvin's philosophical defense of UEE territorial growth, which described military expenditure as striking innovations anvils while fueling expansion's furnaces, Anvil has spent nearly 2 centuries proving that axiom correct. Since the 2772 founding in Nova Kiev, the manufacturer has reliably supplied the Navy with the Hurricane, Devastator, Osprey, Gladiator, and the iconic F-7A Hornet for deployment across every theater from the Hades cluster to the Perry line. Modern combat analytics confirm that Hornet variants have eliminated more enemy assets, measured in total star credits, than all other active Navy fighter designs combined, a record spanning 2 centuries of continuous warfare. No UEE military operation in the last 200 years has commenced without Anvil spacecraft leading the vanguard, and modern carriers still maintain at least one full squadron of these Terra-designed combat craft. Responding to increased Vandal aggression and frontier piracy throughout the 2930, Anvil established its Civilian Development Division to transfer military-grade deterrence into private hands without compromising core naval contracts. The division's production facility stands in Sherman, Castra system, far from the Nova Kiev headquarters, allowing for specialized assembly lines that declassify naval specifications, while adapting the distinctive green-tinted cockpit interface for legal civilian ownership. Their first major commercial success emerged as the F-7C Hornet MKI, which retained the military variant's lethal payload capacity and circular gun mount, while modifying sensor suites for independent pilots operating along dangerous trade routes beyond advocacy protection. This division now produces everything from civilian Gladiator bombers to advanced targeting systems, ensuring that mercenary crews and haulers can deploy the same devastating firepower that Navy squadrons used to defend Perry Line installations. Out-compromising the classified systems reserved for UEE Navy variants, the division immediately established its manufacturing complex in Sherman, Castra system, a military outpost turned industrial hub where orbital security protocols could monitor civilian production without exposing sensitive naval specifications. This facility began retrofitting declassified military frames for private ownership, stripping out classified avionics while retaining the airframe durability that made Anvil famous. Their initial offering, the F-7C Hornet, converted the Navy's frontline interceptor into a civilian defense platform, preserving the twin-engined agility and bubble canopy visibility that J. Harris Arnold pioneered in the original 2788 design. By 2938, these civilian Hornets were already shipping to frontier militias and private security contractors across Stanton and Pyro, marking the first time Anvil sold combat-capable hardware directly to non-military buyers without government intermediaries. The move generated immediate controversy among advocacy officials who questioned whether civilians should possess military-grade killing power. Yet Anvil executives pointed to the escalating Nine Tails raids in 2940 as vindication that private parties required professional deterrence. Building upon the F-7C's market validation, Anvil rapidly expanded its civilian catalog throughout the 2940, releasing the F-8A Lightning's stripped-down counterpart alongside ruggedized variants of the Gladiator bomber for mining defense operations. Sherman facility engineers pioneered modular construction techniques, allowing identical jigs to produce both classified military batches and export-rated hulls, reducing per-unit costs by 30% while maintaining the curved wing profiles inherited from Casse's original aerodynamic theories. This manufacturing efficiency explains why mercenary companies and bounty hunter guilds could suddenly afford hardware previously restricted to naval squadrons, fundamentally altering the power dynamics of frontier law enforcement. By 2945, Anvil's civilian division accounted for 40% of total company revenue, a stark contrast to their first 2 centuries of purely military production. The company's Terra headquarters in Nova Kiev now oversaw dual supply chains feeding both UEE carrier groups and independent operators in Pyro, creating an unprecedented business model where yesterday's classified technology became tomorrow's retail commodity within 18 months of declassification. Today in 2954, the implications of Anvil's civilian armament policy remain deeply contested among Terra's political class, yet the production lines at Sherman continue blending military and commercial output at record capacity. Contemporary Hornet Mk Roman II variants rolling off those Castra assembly floors now feature the distinctive green UI and circular machine gun mounts that J. Harris Arnold specified in his original design language, elements once exclusive to naval aviators now familiar to independent traders in Stanton. While competitors like Drake Interplanetary argue that Anvil's militarization of civilian space undermines non-combat shipping, the statistics remain undeniable. Hornets piloted by private operators have recorded more confirmed kills against Vandal raiders than any other single spacecraft design since the division's founding. Anvil Aerospace has effectively democratized the battlefield, ensuring that the anvils of innovation Robert Calvin praised now strike for anyone with sufficient credits, not merely the empire's uniformed elite. This transformation from exclusive military supplier to frontier arms merchant represents perhaps the most significant evolution in the company's 2-century history, redefining what it means to be battle-ready in the modern empire. At the Sherman facility in Castra, the assembly floors never distinguish between Navy contract numbers and civilian hull registrations. In 2954, critics within Terra's Senate chambers argue that flooding the private market with military-grade frame designs like the F-7C Hornet Mk Roman II and the Terrapin blurs the line between regulated defense and frontier vigilantism. Yet Anvil's production quotas tell a different story. Every third hull rolling off those magnetic sleds carries a civilian transponder, while retaining the same structural hardpoints and avionics mounts found on classified Navy variants. This manufacturing philosophy, established when the civilian division first opened its Castra operations, ensures that a mercenary pilot in Pyro operates equipment nearly identical to what UEE carrier groups deploy against Vandal incursions. The political resistance from Terra's bureaucratic class continues to mount, but Sherman's output remains unwavering. To comprehend why every Anvil cockpit features that distinctive green heads-up display and panoramic visibility, one must examine Leonard Casse's forgotten archives from the 28th century. J. Harris Arnold purchased the entire Casse Aerospace portfolio specifically to legalize design elements he had already been borrowing. The curved wing geometries, the open circular machine gun mounts, and the insistence on unobstructed pilot sightlines. Arnold's settlement with Casse's holding firm in the early 2780 wasn't merely a business transaction. It represented an ideological absorption of Casse's philosophy that the pilot's situational awareness matters more than armor plating. This obsession with visibility explains why modern Hornets and Hurricanes still prioritize glass canopy surface area over reinforced hull thickness, a choice that continues to generate controversy within Navy safety review boards, yet dominates dogfighting kill statistics across 2 centuries of warfare. The company's very name originates from Robert Calvin's 28th century expansionist treatise, where he described military expenditure as striking the anvils of innovation. That metaphor proved prophetic. Naval records confirm that Anvil-designed fighters, particularly the F-7 series Hornets, have eliminated more enemy assets measured in star credits than all competing Navy fighter designs combined across the last 200 years. This staggering combat efficiency stems from Arnold's original insistence on personally signing every subsystem blueprint during the company's first 7 decades, ensuring that no carrier group commander ever faced equipment failure during critical engagements. As Pyro's lawless zones expand and Vandal raiding parties press against UEE borders in 2954, the question isn't whether Anvil will secure new defense contracts, but whether any competing manufacturer like Aegis Dynamics or Drake Interplanetary can ever match this legacy of verified kill ratios and proven battlefield reliability. Naval records from the last 2 centuries paint a stark picture of Anvil's dominance in orbital combat. Since 2772, the company has delivered the Hurricane, Osprey, Devastator, Gladiator, and the legendary Hornet to UEE Navy carriers, with no military campaign launched without Anvil spacecraft leading the assault. The statistics are almost absurd. Hornets alone have annihilated more enemy hardware measured in star credits than every other current Navy fighter design combined, a kill ratio that has kept the company firmly entrenched as the Empire's primary weapons contractor. This isn't merely corporate success. It represents a fundamental shift in how the military views spacecraft procurement, where durability and firepower trump experimental technologies that fail under sustained fire. When admirals plan strike formations, they don't ask if Anvil ships will participate. They calculate how many squadrons they can deploy before the Vandal or pirate contingents scatter. But Anvil's board recognized that battlefield supremacy alone couldn't sustain growth indefinitely, especially as frontier colonies faced escalating Vandal incursions and Nine Tails raids without adequate defenses. In response, they chartered a civilian development division, specifically designed to place military-grade deterrence into private hands without compromising the classified systems reserved strictly for naval command. This strategic pivot required constructing an entirely separate production complex in Sherman, Castra system, where engineers retrofit decommissioned military frames for legal commercial sale. The division's first major commercial breakthrough arrived with the F-7C Hornet, a civilian variant that retained the combat DNA of its military predecessor while accommodating private ownership regulations. By 2954, these retrofitted warships dominate mercenary company rosters and private security fleets throughout Pyro and Stanton, effectively extending Anvil's influence beyond government contracts into the chaotic frontier economy. To understand why every Anvil cockpit features that distinctive circular gun mount and emerald-toned heads-up display, we must examine J. Harris Arnold's obsession with Leonard Casse, the nearly forgotten engineer whose portfolio Arnold acquired after settling a lawsuit in the company's early decades. Arnold personally oversaw every design project during Anvil's first 70 years, insisting on signing off on each subsystem from the Nova Kiev skunkworks facility in Terra, ensuring that Casse's curved wing aesthetics and open circle signet survived into the modern era. This design language wasn't merely nostalgic. It created instant battlefield recognition that allowed UEE pilots to identify friendly units during the heat of combat against Xenothreat insurgents or Vandal raiders. Even now in 2954, when competitors like Aegis Dynamics or Drake Interplanetary pursue angular stealth geometries, Anvil remains committed to those sweeping curves and that unmistakable circular hardpoint that first appeared on the Devastator prototypes in 2798. 10 engineer whose curved wing geometries and circular hardpoint mounts defined an earlier era of Terran spacecraft architecture. When Arnold established his initial skunkworks facility in Nova Kiev during the foundational year of 2772, he deliberately incorporated Casse's signature open circle signet and the revolutionary ergonomic cockpit visibility principles into every prototype blueprint that emerged from that Terra-based laboratory. The aesthetic similarities between Arnold's early designs and Casse's archived works were so pronounced that the holding firm which had acquired Casse Aerospace's intellectual properties filed a formal intellectual property lawsuit against the fledgling manufacturer within the first decade of operation. Rather than engage in protracted litigation across Terra's corporate courts that could bankrupt the startup, Arnold executed a bold maneuver in the early 2780, purchasing the entire Casse portfolio outright to settle the dispute completely and permanently. This strategic acquisition secured Anvil's legal ownership of the circular gun mount design language and emerald-tinted heads-up display schema that remains their enduring visual trademark across the Hornet, Hurricane, and Gladiator lineages, still manufactured in the present day. The corporate moniker itself derives from Robert Calvin's famous 28th century treatise justifying UEE territorial expansion, where he declared that military spending fuels the furnaces of expansion and strikes the anvils of innovation. That phrase proved remarkably prescient when examining comprehensive naval archives. Anvil designs have scored more space-to-space kills than any other military spacecraft manufacturer over the last 2 centuries of continuous production history. Every UEE carrier currently operational maintains at least one full squadron of Anvil fighters aboard its flight deck, and historical combat records indicate that no military campaign has been launched without Anvil hardware leading the assault formation since the company secured its initial Navy contracts in the late 2800s. The statistics regarding Hornet-class superiority are particularly striking. These single-seat fighters alone have annihilated more enemy assets measured in star credits than all other current Navy space fighter designs combined during the same operational period. Such overwhelming combat dominance established Terra-based Anvil as the premier defense contractor for heavy strike vessels including the Hurricane, Osprey, Devastator, and Gladiator throughout the 29th and 30th centuries. Yet maintaining exclusive reliance upon military contracts could not sustain corporate growth indefinitely against the backdrop of increasing Vandal incursions and systematic frontier pirate raids throughout the final decades of the 29th century. Anvil's Terra-based corporate leadership eventually chartered a distinct civilian development division headquartered at the Sherman facility in the Castra system, specifically to transfer military-grade deterrence into responsible private hands during the 2940s. This strategic expansion responded directly to classified advocacy reports, documenting escalating attacks on merchant convoys operating near Pyro and Stanton, allowing independent pilots legal access to Hornet and Hurricane variants previously restricted to official Navy squadrons alone. The board recognized that long-term survival in increasingly contested space required arming everyday citizens with the same rugged engineering specifications that protected UEE capital carriers against xenothreat elements. Consequently, the Sherman assembly lines now actively manufacture civilian-marketed spacecraft, utilizing the identical circular hardpoints and green-tinted interface systems originally developed for the Devastator and Gladiator bomber programs, effectively blurring the practical boundary between government military asset and legitimate private security investment for frontier entrepreneurs. Threats demanded a fundamental restructuring of Anvil's business architecture. Corporate archives reveal that by 2940, classified advocacy intelligence documented unsustainable casualty rates among frontier merchant convoys operating between Stanton and Pyro, prompting the Terra-based board to authorize a radical expansion beyond purely naval supply chains. They established a civilian development division specifically chartered to place military-grade deterrence into private hands, constructing an entirely separate production complex in Sherman, Castra's system, to avoid cross-contamination of classified specifications with export-controlled military hardware. This facility, operational since 2943, deliberately filters battlefield-proven technologies like the Hornet's targeting arrays and the Hurricane's shield harmonics into civilian legal variants available to the Bounty Hunters Guild. The strategic calculus proved immediate. Within 18 months of Sherman reaching full capacity, Anvil's quarterly revenue streams diversified sufficiently to insulate the corporation from single-source defense budget volatility, while simultaneously arming independent operators against vandal raiding parties. Sherman's assembly lines fundamentally altered the socioeconomic landscape of the Castra system within the first decade of operation. By 2950, the facility employed over 40,000 technical specialists drawn from Crusader Industries, displaced workforce, and Hurston Dynamics Union exiles, creating an economic powerhouse independent of Stanton's corporate hegemony. The division's first major civilian adaptation, the Hornet F-7C, retained 90% of its military cousin's dogfighting capabilities while stripping classified IFF transponders and restricted munitions hardpoints for legal compliance with Drake Interplanetary's export standards. Sales figures from 2952 indicate that private operators purchased 12,000 units annually, with 70% of registered buyers holding active Bounty Hunters Guild certifications or Frontier System Defense Militia commissions against Nine Tails operations in the Pyro system. This unprecedented militarization of civilian aerospace created diplomatic friction with the UEE Senate's pacifist caucus. Yet Anvil's quarterly reports demonstrated that commercial revenue now matched naval contracts dollar for dollar, fundamentally rebalancing the company's two-century identity. Standing in 2954, we can trace how Sherman's dual production philosophy reshaped Anvil's corporate DNA across 2 centuries of warfare. The facility now manufactures civilian variants of the Gladiator bomber and Hurricane interceptor, alongside classified naval prototypes and Osprey heavy fighters, utilizing J. Harris Arnold's original circular hardpoint designs that first emerged from Nova Kiev in 2772. Contemporary fleet analyses reveal that civilian Hornets account for 34% of all registered combat spacecraft in the Stanton system, creating an auxiliary defense network that supplements thinly stretched advocacy patrols along the Terra-Stanton trade corridor. This privatization of military capability sparked considerable controversy during the 2953 Senate appropriations hearings. Yet Anvil's executives successfully argued that arming merchant captains against Vandal claws and Xenothreat cells represented cost-effective imperial defense. The company that once exclusively supplied the UEE Navy's expansionary campaigns now maintains parallel assembly lines where naval aviators and independent bounty hunters receive identical flight control software, forging an unprecedented alliance between state warfare and private enterprise. The manufacturing floors at Sherman continue outputting airframes that have defined naval warfare since the 28th century, maintaining production quotas that would have seemed impossible to the original Nova Kiev engineering teams. Consider the statistics that naval intelligence compiled during the Second Terran War. Hornet squadrons alone destroyed enemy assets valued at over 40 billion star credits, a figure that outperforms every other active fighter design currently in the UEE arsenal combined. When the Hurricane entered service in 2915, it brought wing-mounted ballistic solutions that capitalized on the circular hardpoint geometry first sketched by Arnold in 2772, creating kill ratios that embarrassed even the legendary Osprey. Even the aging Gladiator, now rolling off civilian lines in Castra alongside military variants, retains the Devastator's weapons integration systems from the Messer era. When advocacy pilots pursue Nine Tails through Pyro's debris fields today, They rely on these same Teverin-tested avionics. But here's what separates Anvil from competitors like Aegis Dynamics. Every cockpit maintains that signature green heads-up display and panoramic visibility that the founder demanded during those first confidential design sessions. Recent classified reports from the UEE High Command reveal why Sherman's civilian division has become absolutely indispensable during the current crisis of 2,954. Vandal raiding parties struck 17 frontier settlements in the last quarter alone, forcing the underfunded advocacy to rely increasingly on contracted civilian pilots flying militarized Anvil hardware through dangerous sectors like Pyro. The Bounty Hunters Guild has placed unprecedented purchase orders for Sherman-produced variants, citing the urgent need for military-grade deterrence against xenothreat cells operating near Stanton's embattled jump points. This exploding demand directly fulfills the strategic vision articulated when Arnold settled the Casse Aerospace lawsuit centuries ago, absorbing those curved-wing patents that now protect merchant convoys from ruthless nine-tails ambushes. Unlike the exclusive military focus of Crusader Industries defense contracts, Anvil's dual-use philosophy puts Hornet-class performance into private hands. When micro-tech executives request armed escorts through the Ellis system today, they specifically demand the green UI visibility and circular targeting systems that distinguish Terra's finest exports from cheaper competitors, flooding the market from Killian shipyards. Looking toward the horizon, we must ask how long Anvil can maintain this delicate equilibrium between government contracts and open market sales. The Nova Kiev headquarters still reviews every subsystem personally, maintaining that eccentric quality control Arnold instituted in 2772, even as automated factories proliferate across Castra. Robert Calvin's original quote about furnaces of expansion and anvils of innovation appears etched above every Sherman assembly line, reminding workers that their craft fuels both naval campaigns and private enterprise. When the next Vandal swarm inevitably threatens the UEE border, both admirals and independent captains will reach for the same circular hardpoint designs. That singular vision, born from one Terra engineer's fascination with forgotten cast geometries, has created an industrial empire where the distinction between soldier and citizen blurs inside identical cockpits. 2 centuries after Arnold sketched his first curved wing, the question isn't whether humanity will keep fighting. It's which color heads-up display they prefer while doing it. M specification personally, a tradition established by J. Harris Arnold when he founded Anvil in 2772. For over 70 years, Arnold personally approved every subsystem, drawing heavy inspiration from the mostly forgotten engineer Leonard Casse, whose portfolio Anvil purchased outright to settle a lawsuit over design similarities. This obsession with Casse's curved wings and open circle signet explains why modern Anvil ships still feature that distinctive circular machine gun mount and emerald green interface that pilots recognize instantly across human space. The Nova Kiev Skunkworks continues this legacy, ensuring that whether you're seated in a civilian Karak or a military Hurricane, you're experiencing Arnold's uncompromising vision of visibility and ergonomic hardpoint placement. But this raises a fundamental tension. How does a manufacturer maintain such artisanal oversight while simultaneously producing enough fighters to outfit every UEE Navy carrier squadron currently operating in frontier systems? Answering that question requires examining the Castra System facility in Sherman, where Anvil's Civilian Development Division operates alongside military production lines. Open to meet escalating Vandal threats and frontier piracy, this facility represents the company's strategic pivot toward arming private citizens with military-grade deterrence. Consider the Hornet's combat record. Naval intelligence confirms this single design has destroyed more enemy hardware, measured in star credits, than all other current Navy fighter designs combined across 2 centuries of warfare. When the Hurricane entered service in 2915, it brought wing-mounted ballistic hardpoints that redefined heavy fighter doctrine, while the Gladiator and Devastator established bomber specifications still taught at the Navy Academy on MacArthur. Every UEE carrier operating today fields at least one squadron of Anvil-designed spacecraft, a monopoly that generates revenue streams funding further expansion. Yet this military dependence creates vulnerability, because when the Bounty Hunters Guild places bulk orders for Cutlass Blacks, Anvil must balance those contracts against classified Navy requisitions for next-generation Osprey variants. Standing in 2954, we find Anvil navigating the precise equilibrium that Robert Calvin envisioned when he wrote about military spending fueling furnaces of expansion. The company has spent nearly 2 centuries striking anvils of innovation, yet the frontier violence shows no signs of abating. Recent years have seen increased raids by the Nine Tails and Xenothreat extremists, forcing Anvil to accelerate production of the Valkyrie dropship variants alongside their standard fighter lines. Terra's bureaucratic oversight demands constant compliance audits, while Pyro Systems' lawless traders offer gray market opportunities that threaten corporate licenses. Harris Arnold's successors now face decisions he never imagined. Whether to license Carrack exploration vessels to mercenary guilds or withhold Gladiator bombers from Stanton's private security forces. The Nova Kiev headquarters monitors profit margins from both sectors, knowing that a single misstep in Hurston Dynamics territory could sever the military contracts that built their empire. The question isn't whether Anvil can survive, but which master they will ultimately serve when the Vandal Claw reaches Terra's doorstep. Enturi's translating military necessity into industrial dominance, yet contemporary pressures force uncomfortable adaptations. With civilian operations now centered at Sherman in the Castra system, Anvil balances classified Navy contracts against public sales to merchants and mercenaries. The transition wasn't simple. After decades of exclusive government work, the board approved private distribution of Gladiator bombers and Osprey gunships during the 2860, fundamentally altering revenue streams. Today, dock workers at orbital factories retrofit military-grade Hornets with quantum drives for independent contractors, a practice unthinkable during Arnold's lifetime. This duality raises uncomfortable questions about arming civilians with weapons originally designed to breach Vandal capital ships, but with frontier settlements demanding protection and advocacy forces stretched thin. Anvil executives argue that deterrence serves the same strategic goal that fueled their expansion since 2772. Examining Anvil's visual language reveals the obsessive hand of Harris Arnold still pressing against modern manufacturing like a ghost in the machine. Every cockpit retains that distinctive circular machine gun mount, a signature borrowed from Leonard Casse's forgotten archives that Arnold acquired to settle litigation in the 2780s. The emerald green user interface, visible across Hornet and Hurricane dashboards alike, traces back to Arnold's personal color preferences during the company's first 70 years of operation. Even the Devastator's aggressive wing angles echo Casse's curved aerofoil theories that Arnold studied as a student. When the Hurricane debuted in 2915, specifications demanded compatibility with these legacy subsystems, ensuring production lines in Nova Kiev never fully abandoned their founders' eccentric standards. Naval pilots often joke that flying an Anvil craft feels like operating a museum piece that happens to carry devastating military-grade ordnance. Current threat assessments from the UEE Navy validate Anvil's continued dominance in aerospace lethality. Statistics confirm that Hornet fighters alone have destroyed more enemy hardware, measured in star credits, than every other active Navy space fighter design combined across the past 2 centuries. This staggering metric reflects not merely engineering superiority, but Anvil's saturation of carrier decks. No capital ship operates without at least one squadron of their designs. When Xenothreat extremists raided shipping lanes near Pyro last year, mercenary companies flying civilian spec Gladiators held the line until reinforcements arrived from Terra. Meanwhile, Sherman facility reports indicate production quotas rising 40% to address Nine Tails activity around Stanton. Whether striking Vandal formations or arming bounty hunters against frontier pirates, Anvil's commitment to Calvin's original vision, striking innovation upon the anvil of necessity, remains the definitive military-industrial contract in human space. Star credits than all other contemporary Navy fighter designs combined. This quantifies what every carrier captain in UEE space already knows. No military campaign in the last 2 centuries has launched without Anvil's spacecraft leading the charge. The Hurricane, Gladiator, and Devastator all bear the DNA of J. Harris Arnold's original Skunk Works in Nova Kiev, Terra, where the eccentric designer maintained hands-on control for 7 decades following the firm's 2772 establishment. That obsessive oversight created a lineage where every subsystem serves lethality first. When Calvin penned his early justifications for UEE expansion, using those famous furnace and anvil metaphors, he couldn't have predicted how literally the manufacturer would embody industrial innovation. Today, every capital ship in the fleet hosts at least one full squadron of these Terra-born predators, ensuring Anvil's continued dominance in aerospace lethality. But how does a century-old military monopoly adapt when frontier lawlessness demands new solutions? Anvil's answer came through establishing their civilian development division, shifting manufacturing to the Sherman facility deep within Castra to escape Terra's bureaucratic gravity. This plant now produces deterrence for everyday citizens facing escalating Vandal incursions and Nine Tails raids across the frontier worlds. The corporate evolution required purchasing Leonard-Casse's entire portfolio back in 2772, settling lawsuits while absorbing the curved wings and open circle signet that define their visual language. By 2954, this hybrid heritage, military-grade systems filtered through civilian accessibility, has positioned Anvil as the primary supplier for the Bounty Hunters Guild and independent operators who cannot rely on thin advocacy protection in lawless pyro or the corporate-controlled reaches of Stanton, where pirate activity surges. Looking at any Anvil cockpit reveals the stubborn persistence of Arnold's old-school design philosophy. The distinctive circular machine gun mount frames every pilot's view with that signature green UI unchanged since the 28th century. These aren't mere aesthetic choices, but functional inheritances from Leonard Casse's forgotten engineering, resurrected when the founder bought Casse Aerospace's rights to settle litigation in 2772. In 2954, this visual continuity serves as psychological warfare. Enemies recognize the silhouette immediately, while pilots inherit 2 centuries of lethal refinement. Whether operating a Carrack-class exploration platform or competing against Drake Interplanetary for frontier salvage contracts, Anvil's Terra-based manufacturing continues to strike that precise balance between obsessive innovation and battlefield reliability. The anvils keep ringing across human space, not because the galaxy has grown safer, but because this manufacturer ensured that when survival depends on aerospace superiority, the UEE and its citizens hold the deadliest tools ever forged. That circular mount isn't merely a design quirk, but rather the physical manifestation of J. Harris Arnold's refusal to compromise on pilot visibility and weapon integration. When the UEE Navy evaluates combat effectiveness across its carrier groups, they measure success in star credits destroyed, a metric where Hornet squadrons have consistently outperformed every other fighter design currently in service, including the Gladiator and Hurricane lineages that share that same Nova Kiev engineering DNA. Arnold settled the lawsuit over Leonard Casse's portfolio back in 2772, not to bury a rival, but to preserve a philosophy of curved wings and open sightlines that he believed essential to survival. Nearly 2 centuries later, every deployment to the Pyro system or defense of the Stanton shipping lanes still relies on that same stubborn insistence that the pilot's eye must dominate the battlefield. The green glow remains unbroken. So how does a Terra-based manufacturer rooted in exclusive Navy contracts since 2772 justify its existence when frontier warfare demands mass accessibility rather than elite specialization? The answer emerged through Anvil's Civilian Development Division, established precisely as Vandal raiding parties intensified their incursions into the Castra system, and the Nine Tails began consolidating control over Pyro's lawless expanse. By relocating production to the Sherman facility, Anvil translated its Devastator and Osprey military architectures into deterrence that independent operators could actually procure without Admiralty clearance. This wasn't corporate charity, but rather strategic necessity. The UEE advocacy simply cannot patrol every jump point between micro-tech and the frontier. So Arnold's successors weaponized the very accessibility that Casse Aerospace once championed. In 2954, that Sherman plant represents the logical conclusion of an old obsession, putting military-grade survivability into hands that government contracts never reached. J. Harris Arnold died long before the first shots were fired in the Messer era or the terraforming of Stanton's industrial worlds. Yet his fingerprints remain etched across every quantum drive engagement in UEE space. The holding firm that tried to sue him over Leonard Cass's curved wings and circular signets has been forgotten entirely, while Arnold's purchase of that portfolio ensured his design language would outlive the Terran Senate sessions, where Robert Calvin first spoke of Anvil's striking innovation. Today, whether a pilot flies escort for Hurston Dynamics cargo haulers or hunts bounties through the asteroid belts above Crusader, they sit behind that same green interface that Arnold personally approved in the Nova Kiev Skunk Works. Anvil Aerospace didn't simply build ships for the battlefield. They forged the very definition of what humanity believes a fighter should be. And that definition has not changed in nearly 3 centuries.